YouTube, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be showing you how to architect and design Azure Sentinel. So grab that protein shake and a side of sushi, because you know this one is going to get pretty damn juicy. Architecting and designing Azure Sentinel. So welcome. Let's firstly discuss around what is the best practice for designing Azure Sentinel. So every organization works and deals in different ways. Yes, there are Microsoft standards and baselines for how things should be built and delivered, but every business and organization is going to be different. So there isn't a single best practice. So you may find that some businesses require a single Azure Sentinel instance, which is obviously, the perfect one. It's an ideal world, right? Then you may get businesses where data residency is an issue. So this will require multiple workspaces and instances. And then this brings in an extra layer of complexity managing those instances, along with the analytic rules, playbooks, because you're going to want the same structure across all instances, which you might risk missing that all-important detection or data collection event. Another scenario where a business has multiple teams divided all over, from security to infrastructure to apps to data, etc. So the complexity then becomes segregating those data tables based on RBAC permissions and access per department. So what I mean by this is the infrastructure team will need to query performance data inside the log analytics, but they should not be able to query security event data. So you may have a team of analysts that only use Azure AD and Office 365. So they are only required to see those specific event type tables and nothing else. I actually covered this in a previous video, and I'll chuck that link just above here. So there may be further complexities regarding multiple instances across subscriptions or even tenants. Now, I do touch on Azure Lighthouse in this video, but I won't be diving into the MSSP side of things and how that's architected. So hopefully by the end of this video, you will have a better understanding in how to design and architect Azure Sentinel for your business. Before deploying Azure Sentinel, you need to obviously make sure that your Azure tenant has an Azure Active Directory license and tenant, and of course an active payment method. You obviously need an Azure subscription, which will help you create and track the resources and billing. After your subscription has been created, you need the relevant permissions. If you're owner of the subscription, you'll have full access to the subscription. Once the permissions are verified and working, you should already be looking at a naming convention that's fit for your business. Then you'll move on to deploying a resource group and a log analytics workspace. So I'm assuming and I hope that you already know what a log analytics workspace is, so I don't really need to go into too much detail here. So each workspace has its own separate customer data storage. And each can be configured uniquely to meet business and technical requirements from a security and governance perspective. After your data is ingested by the log analytics service, the data is kept logically separate on each component throughout the service. So all data is tagged per workspace. This tagging persists throughout the data lifecycle and is forced at each layer of the service, so your data is stored in a dedicated database in the storage cluster in the region you have selected. From like a physical security perspective, the log analytics service is managed by Microsoft personnel and all activities are logged and can be audited. So log analytics is operated as an Azure service and does meet Azure compliance and security requirements. So Azure Sentinel can only be enabled to use a single log analytics workspace. Therefore, Microsoft recommend that you centralize all your security logs to a dedicated central workspace. Remember, this is just a recommendation. If your organization requires you to create more than one location to store your data for legal or technical requirements, then you will need to run multiple instances of Azure Sentinel. one log analytics workspace per log analytics workspace, and each instance would need to be monitored and contain the same configuration as one another. You then have Azure Lighthouse. So if your business has multiple subsidiaries that have multiple Azure AD tenants, then you should obviously consider the deployment of Azure Lighthouse. Lighthouse is there to address the needs to manage multiple tenancies, resources in a centralized console. This is usually deployed by managed service security providers who have multiple customers, although it can be used by organizations with complex requirements. So this diagram shows the simple and easiest Azure Sentinel solution. I know there's a lot going on here, but I wanted to give you an overall bigger picture instance as to what it would look like if you architected an Azure platform with various environments and governance. Here we can see we have UAT, security, prod, core, etc. So you can see at the bottom we have a security management group. Underneath that we have a single security subscription, then a bunch of resource groups, and a single workspace and a single Azure Sentinel instance. Now don't be fooled, just because this is a single instance doesn't mean that it's not fit for purpose. If there's no need to complicate things, then don't. It's only when your business has specific compliant data or technical requirements, which is when you should really consider another architecture. So like multi-workspace, now this next design is a single tenant again, but with a multi-workspace. So I've simplified the actual design so it's not to overcomplicate things like the previous image. So I've got rid of all the governance and that just to make sure, to give you a visual aspect. So this is a geographical multi-workspace. So maybe you have a customer that has multiple offices or associates in different regions. The different regions cannot talk to each other from a legal perspective. So there's a layer of security that needs to be in place to segregate this. So security data in West Europe will need to go to the West Europe instance, and the security data for North Europe will need to go to the North Europe instance. And any resources that get deployed within the environment for, say, West Europe will automatically get enrolled into West Europe and vice versa. This is providing that you have policies enabled for onboarding those resources. So if a virtual machine gets deployed, you want to make sure that you're monitoring all those components. If it's in West Europe, all those components go to the West Europe workspace. So this next design is the more complex of the three. So this is a multi-tenancy design. So as we mentioned, this may be required when you need to run multiple instances of Azure Sentinel in different tenants, regions, and subscriptions, etc. So this is when you should really consider Azure Sentinel, Azure Lighthouse as a deployment methodology. So this would help you monitor the multiple instances, which we briefly touched on earlier. Now, this isn't obviously recommended for normal customers, but this is kind of aimed at Microsoft security service providers. That will be the customer's SOC, essentially. Now, I have worked with a couple of customers which had various subsidiaries, and they have multiple tenants in Azure AD, Lighthouse, and this was the chosen product for them. So it's not uncommon. It's just what's going to be the best fit for the customer without making it too complex. Again, the best design would just be a single instance, but as in most cases, it all depends on the customer's data residency, technical requirements, and compliancy requirements. So once you've figured out your architecture design, then you need to determine what data sources you're going to connect and the logs which are going to be ingested. The focus would then shift onto business use case structure. So how much data is going to be ingested. You could leverage a simple test to perform a monthly analysis and assess how much data is actually going to come into Sentinel. So you'd spin up a Sentinel instance, connect all that data, and then that will give you a proper understanding of what sort of data retention process would need to be implemented to ensure that you're not leaving data in Sentinel for a period of time, which is going to cost you, obviously, large amounts of money. Once the deployment is up and running, further exercises would include analytic use case development, playbook development, workbook development, and improving your SOC operational efficiency. So key takeaways: don't overcomplicate things. If there's no need to, don't overcomplicate it. Obviously consider business requirements from, again, a legal, compliant, and technical perspective. Consider table level RBAC permissions for IT operational duties. If you need to segregate the data for data tables for IT ops, then consider using an RBAC model. A common best practice would be to configure Azure security policy for all resource diagnostic logs to send their data to a log analytics workspace. So if you go from the first architecture picture I showed you, set up a policy at that management group level and not the root level, because if a customer decides they need to get another subsidiary in there, then you have that room for branching out. If you have a geographical requirement for data collection, then consider obviously multiple policies at separate management group levels. So everything is being done programmatically now in the cloud. So look to adopt a Sentinel as code methodology approach, especially if you're going to be working with multiple workspaces. You're going to want to consider consistent configuration across both entities. So if you have, North Europe and West Europe, both Azure Sentinel instances, you want to make sure that you have some form of DevOps pipeline controlling those. So if you go back to fine tune an analytic, you want to make sure that that same analytic gets pushed to both instances. If it only gets pushed to one, it will get missed in the other. So having that Sentinel as code approach is really where it's going to make you shine with an environment which has, those multiple instances. And that brings us to the end of the video. So hopefully now you will have a better understanding of how to architect and design Azure Sentinel. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you don't, well, that's just fine. Please subscribe, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your nan. Cheers.